true nature of the threat. As the meticulously crafted plans of Kodo's resistance began to unfold, the armies of Tajera and Wolfia launched a sudden and powerful offensive against the guerrillist borders. The professional warriors of Tajera and Wolfia moved with a precision that caught the guerrillist border guards off guard, effortlessly overcoming their defenses and advancing over 100 kilometers into guerrillist territory. Yet, just as suddenly as the invasion began, the invaders halted, their forces strategically positioned and awaiting the arrival of the main guerrillist army. This unexpected pause puzzled both the defenders and Ruda himself. Unaware of the true nature of the threat looming over his regime, Ruda was left reeling by the sudden outbreak of war. The continent, which had briefly known peace, was once again thrust into chaos. Fury seethed within Ruda as he convened an emergency meeting with his top officials. The once confident ruler was now a man on the brink of desperation, his mind racing to comprehend how such an attack could have taken him by surprise. His voice, normally so composed and authoritative, was now laced with rage and frustration. "Why did they attack us?" Ruda bellowed, slamming his fist onto the table. "Why was I informed so late? Where are the intelligence officers? How did they allow this situation to unfold?" The officials in the room exchanged nervous glances, each of them acutely aware of the danger in Ruda's escalating temper. They had seen him like this before, and they knew that someone would be made to pay for this failure. As the tension in the room grew, one of the advisors cautiously spoke up. "Sir, we need to meet with Rusi immediately. He's the head of our intelligence. He should have known about this mobilization," the advisor suggested, his voice trembling slightly. Ruda's eyes narrowed as he processed the suggestion. "Yes. Rusi," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where is Rusi?" A tense silence fell over the room as the officials exchanged uncertain looks. No one had seen Rusi in days. Panic began to set in as they realized that their intelligence chief, the man responsible for safeguarding the regime, was conspicuously absent. Unbeknownst to Ruda and his advisors, Rusi had been secretly working against them for months. His loyalty to the oppressive Ruda dynasty had long since eroded, replaced by a deep-seated resentment and a desire for change. Day by day, Rusi's disappointment in the regime had hardened into a hatred so intense that he could no longer stand by and watch as his country suffered under Ruda's tyranny. And so, Rusi had made a fateful decision. He had joined Kodo's resistance, working from within the very heart of guerrillists' intelligence apparatus to undermine Ruda's rule. His defection was the first of many in what would become a pivotal movement to reshape the future of guerrillist. Rusi had carefully orchestrated the invasion's success, leaking critical intelligence to Kodo and his allies while simultaneously ensuring that the guerrillist defenses would be caught unprepared. His absence from the meeting was no accident. It was a calculated move, designed to sow confusion and distrust within Ruda's ranks. As Ruda's fury mounted, he demanded answers from his officials. "Find Rusi," he shouted, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "I want him brought before me, now." But even as the orders were issued and the search for Rusi began, the truth was already becoming clear. Rusi was gone. He had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the bitter knowledge that the regime had been betrayed from within. Meanwhile, Kodo's plans continued to unfold with precision. Step 4 of his strategy, the most secretive and critical phase, was now in motion. With Rusi's defection, Kodo had gained a powerful ally within the guerrillist intelligence network, one who had already begun to weaken the regime from the inside. As the news of Rusi's betrayal spread, it sent shockwaves through guerrillist society. Citizens who had long harbored doubts about Ruda's rule now saw in Rusi's actions a glimmer of hope, a sign that the regime was not as invincible as it seemed. Dissent, once whispered in hushed tones, now began to grow louder. For Kodo, Rusi's defection was a major victory, but it was only the beginning. He knew that the hardest battles were yet to come. Ruda would not go down without a fight, and the forces of oppression would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on power. As the resistance prepared for the next phase of their campaign, Kodo reflected on the significance of Rusi's betrayal. It was a turning point in their struggle, a sign that the time was right for the people of Guerrillas to rise up and claim their freedom. But it was also a reminder that the road ahead would be long and treacherous, fraught with danger and uncertainty. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine the fate of the continent. As the armies of Tagera, Wolfia, Leonias, and Birais prepared to strike at the heart of Guerillist, Kodo and his allies knew that the moment of truth was fast approaching. In the darkened corridors of Guerillist, the wheels of revolution had begun to turn. And as the storm of war gathered strength, the people of the continent held their breath, knowing that the outcome of this battle would shape the future of their world. The time for resistance had come, and with it, the dawn of a new era. The weight of command. In the heart of the war room, where maps sprawled across the table like ancient parchment scrolls and the scent of ink mingled with the tension in the air, Ruda, the Datu of Guerillist, found himself enveloped in a storm of remorse and confusion. The dim light from the flickering lanterns cast long, wavering shadows on the walls, mirroring the turmoil within his mind. Surrounded by his most trusted advisors, Ruda sought solace in their counsel, desperate for answers to the pressing questions that gnawed at his troubled mind. Where is Koven? Where is Yaren? And the others who fought by my side? Ruda's voice, tinged with a sense of urgency and disbelief, pierced the heavy silence that hung over the room. His eyes scanned the faces of those present, searching for the familiar features of his once loyal generals. Why are they absent from this meeting? Where could they have gone amidst this war? An uneasy murmur rippled through the room as the officials exchanged anxious glances. The official tasked with relaying information to Ruda hesitated, his gaze falling to the ground as if seeking refuge from the weight of the truth. The silence grew heavier, suffocating, until at last, the official spoke. Yes, Datu. You have already dismissed them. Don't you remember? The words hung in the air, laden with a bitter reminder of Ruda's impulsive actions in the throes of anger. The truth, though softly spoken, struck Ruda like a physical blow. Suddenly awakened from the fog of confusion that clouded his memory, Ruda felt the sting of regret pierce his heart like a dagger. The room seemed to spin around him as the reality of his actions crashed down with the weight of 1,000 regrets. In a moment of blind fury, he had cast aside 5 of his most skilled generals, Koven, Yaren, and the others who had once been the pillars of his military command, severing the bonds of camaraderie and trust that had once bound them together in the crucible of war. Closing his eyes, Ruda felt the weight of his impulsive decisions bear down upon him with crushing force. He remembered the countless battles they had fought together, the victories they had celebrated, and the sacrifices they had made for Guerillist. These generals, who had fought valiantly at his side, were now gone, lost to him forever. Their absence left a void in his ranks, a void that could not be easily filled. The war room, once a place of confident decision-making, now felt like a tomb, echoing with the ghosts of Ruda's rash choices. He knew that the loss of these generals would not only weaken his command structure, but also demoralize the troops who had looked up to these leaders. The realization filled him with a deep sense of remorse, but there was no time to dwell on past mistakes. The enemy was at the gates, and he had to act. In a swift response to the looming threat posed by the advancing armies of Tagera and Wolfia, Ruda gathered what remained of his military command. His voice, though shaken by recent events, carried the authority that had once inspired fear and respect across the continent. He ordered the mobilization of 6 legions, each comprising tens of thousands of troops, to counter the relentless onslaught. 4 legions were dispatched westward to confront the Tagera invaders, while 2 legions moved east to engage the Wolfia army. Ruda's strategic decision to divide his forces was born out of necessity, driven by the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Tagera army. With their vast numbers, Tagera posed a formidable challenge that could only be met with a concerted effort from multiple legions. In contrast, the Wolfia army, while formidable in its own right, could be addressed with a smaller force, allowing Ruda to allocate his resources more efficiently. Yet, even as he issued these orders, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. The absence of his trusted generals meant that the burden of command now fell on less experienced shoulders. The battlefield was an unpredictable place, and Ruda knew that every decision he made could be the difference between victory and defeat. As the two opposing armies clashed on the battlefield, the guerrillist forces quickly found themselves ensnared in a web of confusion and uncertainty. The Tagera and Wolfia troops, instead of launching an all-out assault as expected, seemed intent on delaying the guerrillist army, employing tactics that defied conventional warfare. Skirmishes broke out along the front lines, but there was no decisive engagement. It was as if the enemy was toying with them, drawing them deeper into a trap that Ruda could not yet see. Bewildered by the enemy's unorthodox strategy, Ruda grappled with a sense of helplessness and frustration. The battlefield echoed with the deafening roar of cannons and the clash of steel, each explosion a grim reminder of the stakes at hand. He could feel the confidence of his troops waning as the days wore on without a clear objective or victory. Amidst the chaos of battle, Ruda struggled to make sense of the enemy's intentions, his mind racing to unravel the mysteries of their chosen tactics. Why were the Tagera and Wolfia forces holding back? What were they waiting for? With every passing moment, the fog of uncertainty thickened, casting a shadow over Ruda's understanding of the unfolding conflict. In the crucible of war, where every decision carried the weight of countless lives, Ruda found himself standing at a crossroads, torn between the desire to emerge victorious and the fear of failure. The echoes of his past decisions, his dismissal of the generals, haunted him, threatening to cloud his judgment at the most critical of times. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the war room. An aide rushed in, his face pale and strained with worry. "Datu, reports from the front lines," he said breathlessly, handing over a stack of hastily scribbled messages. Ruda scanned the reports, his frown deepening with each passing second. The Tagera forces had advanced further into guerrillist territory, but they were not pushing towards the capital as expected. Instead, they were fortifying positions, creating strongholds that would be difficult to dislodge. The Wolfia army, meanwhile, had taken control of key supply routes, cutting off crucial resources needed to sustain the war effort. Ruda's hands clenched into fists as he realized the enemy's strategy. They were not trying to win the war through direct confrontation. They were bleeding guerrillas dry, forcing them into a war of attrition that they could not afford to fight. His armies were being stretched thin, and without his most trusted generals, he was running out of options. "I need answers," Ruda barked, slamming the reports down on the table. His advisors flinched at the intensity of his voice. "Why are they playing this game with us? What are they waiting for?" The room fell into a tense silence as the advisors exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one of them, an older man with deep lines etched into his face from years of service, spoke up. "Datu, we must consider the possibility that this is not just a military strategy. The enemy may have allies within our borders. There are rumors, whispers of dissent among our own people, of treachery within the ranks." Ruda's eyes narrowed, his anger boiling just below the surface. The thought of betrayal was not new to him, but in this moment, it felt like a personal attack, an insult that cut to the core of his authority. "Who would dare?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Who among us would betray guerrillist in its hour of need?" But even as he asked the question, he knew the answer. The absence of Rusi, the intelligence failures, the delayed response to the invasion, it all pointed to one conclusion. The enemy was not just outside the gates, they were inside, working to dismantle his regime from within. Ruda's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the full scope of the challenge before him. This was no ordinary war. It was a war for the very soul of guerrillist, a battle that would be fought not just with swords and cannons, but with ideas, loyalty, and the will to survive. He could not afford to falter now. The fate of his nation, of his people, depended on his ability to rise above the doubts that plagued him and lead them to victory. With renewed determination, Ruda straightened his back and looked each of his advisors in the eye. "We will not be defeated by treachery," he declared, his voice firm and resolute. "We will root out the traitors, crush the enemy, and restore order to this land. Prepare the legions for a full-scale assault. We will drive them back, no matter the cost." As the advisors scrambled to carry out his orders, Ruda felt a cold, steely resolve settle over him. He had made mistakes, yes, but he would not be defined by them. The war was far from over, and he would fight with every ounce of strength he had left. The battle for Guerrillas had only just begun. Shadows of resistance. In the shadows of the war-torn landscape, Kodo, the mastermind behind the clandestine resistance movement, orchestrated a symphony of calculated maneuvers aimed at dismantling the formidable guerrillist army. He remained concealed from the watchful gaze of Ruda, the tyrant ruler of Guerrillist, who had, in his arrogance, underestimated the power of a silent revolution. Recognizing the futility of engaging in a direct confrontation against Ruda's overwhelming military might, Kodo devised a strategy rooted in the ancient principles of warfare: divide and conquer. The initial clashes between the Tagera and Wolfia armies and the Guerrillist border guards were merely the overture to a much grander composition, a prelude to Kodo's meticulously crafted plan. As the enemy forces grappled with the apparent stalemate at the borders, Kodo's intelligence network worked tirelessly in the background, gathering precise information on the disposition, combat readiness, and morale of the guerrillist army. Unbeknownst to Ruda and his generals, they had unwittingly stumbled into a meticulously laid trap. Every move they made, every order given, played directly into Kodo's hands. The tyrant, confident in his military superiority, had deployed the majority of his forces to the borders to counter the perceived threat from Tagera and Wolfia. This left only a handful of corps to safeguard the capital and its surrounding provinces, a critical vulnerability that Kodo was poised to exploit. As the tension mounted, Kodo issued the long-awaited signal to his remaining intelligence forces, a covert message that rippled through the resistance like a spark igniting dry tinder. The time had come to strike. Like shadows emerging from the darkness, the resistance troops sprang into action, their movements synchronized with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Divide and conquer, Kodo's mantra echoed through the ranks of the resistance as they launched their multi-pronged assault on the unsuspecting guerrillist army. With surgical precision, they struck at the heart of the enemy's defenses, targeting key strategic positions, communication hubs, and supply lines with deadly efficiency. Bridges were destroyed, cutting off reinforcements. Ammunition depots were set ablaze, leaving the guerrillist soldiers scrambling for resources. The capital, once considered impenetrable, suddenly found itself vulnerable, its defenses crumbling under the relentless pressure of the resistance. In the span of a single night, Kodo's forces achieved what many had deemed impossible: the disintegration of the guerrillist army from within. The surprise and ferocity of the resistance's assault left the guerrillist generals reeling, their carefully laid plans shattered in the face of an enemy they could neither see nor anticipate. The army, once a cohesive and disciplined force, began to splinter as panic set in. Command structures collapsed, and soldiers deserted in droves, unwilling to fight a battle they no longer believed they could win. The guerrillist generals, caught off guard by the suddenness and ferocity of the resistance's assault, struggled to regain control of the situation. With their forces scattered and demoralized, they found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before, a shadowy adversary whose movements remained shrouded in secrecy. Rumors spread like wildfire through the ranks, tales of phantom warriors who struck without warning and disappeared just as quickly, leaving behind only destruction and fear. As the battle raged on, Kodo's influence extended far beyond the confines of the battlefield. Through his carefully cultivated network of allies and sympathizers within guerrillist society, he sowed the seeds of dissent and rebellion, further undermining Ruda's grip on power. Pamphlets appeared overnight in the streets, urging the citizens to rise up against their oppressors. Secret meetings were held in back rooms and basements, where plans were made to sabotage the guerrillist war effort from within. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, chipped away at the foundation of Ruda's regime. But amidst the chaos and bloodshed, a sense of unity and purpose emerged among the resistance fighters. Bound by their unwavering devotion to Kodo and their shared vision of a free and just society, they fought with a courage and determination that defied all odds. These were not merely soldiers, they were people fighting for their homes, their families, and their future. Each victory, no matter how minor, was celebrated not just as a military success, but as a step closer to reclaiming their homeland from the clutches of tyranny. With each victory on the battlefield, the resistance grew stronger, their resolve hardened by the knowledge that they were fighting not just for their own freedom, but for the future of their nation. The once daunting guerrillist army, now a shadow of its former self, found itself on the defensive, struggling to fend off an enemy it could not understand. And as the tide of battle turned in their favor, the resistance fighters knew that victory was within their grasp, if only they had the courage to seize it. In the war room, Ruda fumed, his frustration boiling over as reports of the resistance's successes reached his ears. His carefully crafted plans were unraveling before his eyes, and he could feel the sands of power slipping through his fingers. Yet, in his arrogance, he refused to acknowledge the full extent of the threat posed by Kodo and his followers. He dismissed the resistance as a mere nuisance, believing that his military might would eventually crush them. But Kodo knew better. He understood that the true power of a movement lay not in its ability to wage war, but in its ability to inspire and unite. The resistance was more than an army, it was an idea, a vision of a future free from oppression. And as long as that idea lived in the hearts of the people, no amount of force could extinguish it. The war continued to rage, but the balance of power had shifted. The guerrillist forces, once feared and respected, now found themselves outmaneuvered and outthought at every turn. Kodo's strategy of divide and conquer had worked to perfection, and the cracks in Ruda's regime were beginning to show. The endgame was approaching, and both sides knew it. For Ruda, it was a battle to maintain control, to preserve the power he had fought so hard to acquire. For Kodo, it was a fight for liberation, to bring an end to the tyranny that had plagued his people for too long. In the heart of the war-torn landscape, amidst the ruins of a once great empire, the final pieces of Kodo's plan were falling into place. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, a battle that would decide the fate of the continent. And as Kodo prepared to lead his forces into the fray, he knew that the time had come to strike the final blow, to topple the tyrant and bring peace to a land torn apart by war. The shadows of resistance had grown into a force that could no longer be ignored. The fight for freedom was about to reach its climax, and Kodo was ready to see it through to the end. A tyrant's last stand. When news of the resistance's daring move reached Ruda, the guerrillist tyrant, rage coursed through his veins like wildfire. His hands trembled with fury as he pored over detailed reports of the resistance's rapid advance, the collapse of key strategic points, and the growing dissension within his own ranks. The empire he had meticulously constructed over the years seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. In a desperate attempt to maintain control, Ruda hastily ordered the 3 remaining corps of his army to quell the rebellion and defend the capital at all costs. But to Ruda's shock and disbelief, his orders fell on deaf ears. The generals who commanded these corps, once loyal supporters of his regime, remained unresponsive to his desperate pleas. These men, who had previously prided themselves on their loyalty to Ruda and fought alongside him in countless battles, now stood silent, their hearts heavy with discontent and uncertainty. In a stunning show of defiance, they chose to remain neutral, refusing to act against the advancing resistance forces. The betrayal of these once loyal generals struck Ruda like a thunderbolt, leaving him both shocked and enraged. These were men he had trusted implicitly, comrades who had stood by him through countless victories and glories. Yet, in a moment of rebellion, they turned against him, driven by a potent mix of disillusionment with his autocratic regime and fear of the rising tide of resistance that now threatened to engulf the capital in chaos. For years, Ruda ruled the guerrillists with an iron fist, ruthlessly suppressing dissent and stamping out any form of opposition. His regime was marked by tight control, harsh punishments, and a relentless effort to maintain absolute power. But these harsh tactics sowed resentment and bitterness even among his own ranks, planting the seeds of rebellion that had now blossomed into full-blown insurrection. In the corridors of power, murmurs of discontent had long circulated among the senior military leadership. Though outwardly loyal, Ruda's generals had grown weary of his oppressive rule and the suffering it inflicted on the guerrillists. They had witnessed the toll it took on the country, the instability simmering beneath the surface, and the brutality used to silence dissent. Now, faced with the growing strength of the Kodo resistance movement, they saw an opportunity, perhaps their only chance, to distance themselves from a tyrant who had long since lost the trust and respect of his people. As Kodo's forces closed in on Hunxi, the capital already stained with the blood of countless protesters, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation that would decide the fate of the guerrillists. The streets of Hunxi, once bustling with life and commerce, were eerily quiet, the atmosphere thick with anticipation and fear. Shops were boarded up, windows shuttered, and the usually bustling market lay deserted. Citizens, fearful of the coming conflict, had taken refuge in their homes, while others fled the city, seeking safety in the countryside. In the heart of the city, within the fortified walls of the palace, Ruda seethed with anger and frustration. The once immovable ruler now felt his power slipping away with each passing moment. He paced the hall, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors, his mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. Surrounded by treachery, he faced a stark choice: cling to his dictatorship and risk plunging the guerrillists into civil war, or relinquish power and face the consequences of his despotism. But even as the walls closed in around him, Ruda refused to back down without a fight. His pride and determination would not allow him to surrender. With the last remnants of his loyal forces at his command, he prepared to defend Hunxi to the bitter end. He would not be remembered as a ruler who capitulated to rebels. He would go down in history as a man who fought to the last breath to preserve his empire, no matter the cost. The remaining loyalists, seasoned soldiers and die-hard supporters, gathered in the palace grounds, ready to sacrifice their lives to protect their ruler. They were outnumbered by the advancing resistance, but their resolve was unshakable. They knew this might be their last battle, but they were prepared to die for their leader. As the sun began to set, casting the city in a blood-red hue, the distant beat of drums and marching footsteps echoed up to the palace walls. The resistance had arrived, their forces closing in on the city from all sides. The once proud guerrillist capital was now a battlefield, with the fate of the city at stake. Inside the palace, Ruda donned his armor, a relic from his days as a young warrior. The metal was worn and scarred from years of fighting, but it still held a faint shine. He strapped on his sword, the symbol of his power, and looked back at the throne he had occupied for so many years. It no longer felt like a throne of power, but a reminder of the isolation that came with his rule. With a final, determined breath, Ruda stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the city. Below, his loyalists lined up, ready to defend the palace with their lives. Beyond the palace gates, the resistance gathered, their banners fluttering in the evening breeze. The air was tense, the silence before the storm. For a moment, Ruda allowed himself to feel the weight of his decisions, the choices that had brought him to this moment, the lives lost, and the power he had clung to so fiercely. But there was no time for regret. The battle for Hunxi was about to begin, and with it, the final chapter of Ruda's reign. As the first sounds of battle rang out, Ruda braced himself for the fight ahead. He knew this would be his last, but he was determined to make it one that would be remembered for generations to come. The fate of guerrillists was at stake, and with it, the legacy of the man who had ruled this nation with an iron fist.